I've gotten a few questions about how to organize the solar car report, so this video should help with that. I know that in the lab document that I gave you, it goes over A, B, and C. We'll talk about D, science, in a minute. A being design, process, explanation, B being problems, solutions, construction in general, and C being improvements. Over here I've got four just like parts of the car listed that I thought of randomly, right? The wheels, the chassis, axles, bearings versus eye hooks. So a lot of people have been talking about setting up their lab report in this format, A, B, and C. I think that's problematic because, for instance, wheels, you would talk about wheels probably in your design ideas, in your problems, and in your improvements. So you're going to talk about wheels 3 different times. You'd probably do the same thing for chassis, axles, and bearings. So each of those you would talk about in 3 different sections, which would make the discussion of wheels or of the axles very fragmented. So rather than set your lab up with A, B, and C, I would suggest one of 2 options. Option 1 being part by part, and option 2 being kind of a story. So part by part is after your introduction, you start talking about the wheels. So you talk about your design ideas for the wheels, any problems, solutions, and construction notes that you have about using those wheels, and any improvements that you have for the wheels in the future. Maybe get different wheels or add rubber bands. And then you do the same thing when you're talking in your paragraph about the chassis and your paragraph or 2 about the axles, right? You would talk about these 3 things over here. That way, everything about the wheels is in 1 or 2 paragraphs together. Everything about the chassis, the axles, the bearings, all of those things are in a paragraph just about the axles, for instance. Another way of doing it, option 2, is a story. This is telling it in chronological order. So basically following along with your project notes, you would just start out with whatever research you did initially, whatever ideas you had, whatever you did on day 1, then day 2, then day 3. The only issue that could come up with here is if you talk initially about wheels on day 1 and you don't run into the problem with wheels until day 7. Now, it's not a problem to have such a big gap in your conversation about wheels, so long as it makes sense in the story that you're telling, right? If it's chronological, then it makes sense. You could, if you're doing the story, your improvements could either be weaved in throughout the story that you're telling, right? As you talk about the problems and solutions to the axles, for instance, you could suggest an improvement right then. Or you could wait until the whole lab report is kind of done and make the improvement section be on its own. Either way would be fine. Same could go for part by part, though I think if you're doing it that way, it makes sense to give a suggestion for that car part if you have one. Very briefly, intro and conclusion should be brief. 3 sentences. What the project is about, what you were doing, maybe something about the materials that you have, or that you didn't have a step-by-step guide for this project like you did the mousetrap car, so it was your own designs, your own ideas, your own research as well. The science section, we're going to talk a lot more about this in detail, but this is really 2 or 3 paragraphs where we're not just giving definitions, right? We're explaining how the car works in relationship to all of these concepts. Speed, velocity, acceleration, force, friction, Newton's first, second, and third laws, work and power, and how all of this results in the motion of the car. So explaining those things and kind of weaving a little 2 to 3 paragraphs, showing all those concepts that we've talked about over the last 6 months and how they interact, how they cause the car to move, that is perfect. You don't need to do any more research. You do not need to look up, the electrical workings of the motor or the batteries or anything like that. Just using the concepts that we've learned, put together a paragraph, 2, 3 paragraphs, explaining the science behind the solar car and its motion. So just to sum things up, science we'll talk about a lot more. That gave you a little bit of info. I highly suggest not setting up your solar car in A, B, and C format. I think that'll be very fragmented. Instead, go part by part or tell a story chronological based off of your notes.